12 of the country's top robotics engineers stood frozen around a machine that refused to answer them. 7 hours had passed since the system went dark, and every reset, every diagnostic, every desperate guess had failed. Snow fell steadily over the research campus outside Denver, grounding half the investors' flights and shrinking a deadline that was already impossible. Then a young woman pushing a cleaning cart paused at the edge of the room and asked a question so simple that 3 engineers actually laughed out loud. Nobody expected the answer to come from her. Within a minute, she had traced the failure to a single overlooked part, made one small adjustment with her bare hands, and watched a $50 million machine roar back to life while the entire room went silent around her. If you love stories where quiet kindness finally gets the recognition it deserves, hit subscribe and stay with Winter Veil until the very end, because this story is only just beginning. Winter has always felt like a season of second chances to me, the kind of hush that lets something buried find its way back to the surface. And that is exactly the feeling I wanted to give Marin in the story you are about to hear. I hope it warms you the way the best snowy evenings do. Marin Ashcombe was 27 years old and had spent the last 3 years cleaning the labs and hallways of Holloway Robotics, one of the fastest-growing medical technology companies in the country. Most of the scientists who worked there did not know her last name. A few did not know she had a name at all, and simply nodded at the woman with the cart before returning to their screens. What none of them knew was that Marin had once been 2 years away from a mechanical engineering degree at the University of Colorado, third in her class, with professors who used to stop her in the hallway to ask what she thought of their latest projects. Then her father's heart began to fail. The medical bills started arriving faster than she could open them, and she left school to take any job with hours flexible enough to get him to his appointments. She never stopped learning. Every lunch break, she found a quiet corner and read whatever technical manual had been left in the recycling bin that week. On the nights her father slept early, she sat by the window with her old university notebook, sketching gear ratios and hydraulic diagrams by the light of the street lamp while snow gathered soundlessly on the sill outside. Engineering had never left her. She had simply lost the room where people let her practice it out loud. That morning, before her shift, her father had watched her tie her boots by the door and asked, the way he asked most mornings, whether today was the day she was finally going to tell someone at that company what she used to be. Marin laughed it off the way she always did, kissed the top of his head, and told him that cleaners who talked about engineering tended to get looks, not job offers. He shook his head and told her that a man who taught shop class for 30 years knew talent when he raised it, and that the world would catch up eventually whether she gave it permission or not. Gareth Holloway had built the company from a garage workshop into one of the most respected names in medical robotics. And at 34, he still worked like a man, trying to prove something to a father who had walked out on the family business 2 decades earlier and taken half its money with him. Gareth was tall, dark-haired, sharp-jawed in the way photographers loved for magazine covers, and almost entirely allergic to trusting people quickly, a habit his father had taught him the hard way. The demonstration scheduled for that snowy Thursday was the most important morning in the company's history. A surgical robotics system 3 years in development was set to be shown live to a room of government regulators and investors whose money would decide whether the device ever reached a single hospital. Gareth had barely slept in a week. He believed, in a way he rarely said aloud, that this machine could save more lives than anything his family name had ever touched. 40 minutes before the investors arrived, the central control unit shut down without warning. Backup systems failed to engage. The diagnostic screen returned nothing but a blinking cursor and a string of error codes nobody in the building had ever seen before. Gareth called every senior engineer he had, and within 20 minutes the lab was full of the best minds his money could summon on a Thursday morning. They dismantled access panels, swapped circuit boards, rewrote startup scripts, and checked thousands of individual connections one by one. Snow kept falling outside the tall windows, thick and unhurried, the kind of snowfall that made the whole city go quiet even as the room inside grew louder with frustration. Reporters had already begun setting up cameras in the lobby. Investors murmured to each other in low, doubtful voices. Gareth stood at the center of it all with his arms crossed, keeping his face as still as he could manage, though inside he felt the years of work threatening to collapse in a single overcast morning. Victor Lang, the company's chief operations officer and Gareth's most trusted deputy for nearly a decade, kept a hand on his shoulder and told him it would be fine, that the engineers would find it, that panicking would not fix a single wire. Gareth nodded without really hearing him and asked, again, how much longer the lead engineer needed. The answer, delivered without much confidence, was that nobody could say. One of the lead investors, a silver-haired woman named Priscilla Renner who controlled a fund large enough to make or break the launch on her own, checked her watch twice in the span of a minute and told the man beside her that she had sat through 3 demonstrations that year alone that promised the future of medicine and delivered nothing but excuses. "I don't need a miracle," she said, loud enough for Gareth to hear across the room. "I need it to turn on." Gareth absorbed the comment without flinching outwardly, though it landed exactly where she meant it to. Marin had been cleaning the observation hallway that overlooked the lab when she noticed something the engineers had not. Every one of them was chasing complicated electronic failures, checking software and circuitry with the confidence of men who assumed the answer had to be as sophisticated as the machine itself. Nobody had looked at the simplest mechanical safeguard on the entire unit, the manual transport lock meant to protect the arm during shipping. She set her cart against the wall and stepped just inside the doorway, waiting for a break in the noise. When one finally came, she asked, hesitant and without much confidence in her own voice, whether anyone had checked if the transport lock had been fully released after the machine was moved into position that morning. A consultant in an expensive suit turned around, looked her up and down, and said, "That would be a rookie mistake, sweetheart. We would have caught that in the first 5 minutes." 2 of the younger engineers laughed, not unkindly, more out of exhaustion than cruelty, and went back to their screens. One of them added, not even looking up, "It's a $50 million machine, not a printer jam." Marin felt her face go warm, apologized for interrupting, and reached for her cart to leave the way she always did, without making anyone remember she had been in the room at all. Gareth had noticed her before the laughter started. There was something in the certainty of her question that did not match the way she carried herself, a woman who clearly expected to be ignored but had spoken up anyway. He crossed the room before she reached the door and said, "Wait, what exactly did you see?" Marin turned back, surprised he had bothered to ask. "I didn't see anything for certain," she admitted. "I just noticed nobody's checked the mechanical lock. Everyone's assuming it's electronic because the machine looks complicated. But complicated machines still have simple parts." "Show me," Gareth said, and something in the flatness of his voice made the room quiet down enough to listen. Marin hesitated only a second before walking to the machine. She knelt beside the housing and pointed to a narrow red pin tucked beneath a protective bracket near the base of the robotic arm, a component so small that none of the diagnostic software had a way to detect it. "If this pin is even partially engaged after transport," she said, "every sensor on the arm reads the whole system as unsafe to activate. It won't matter how perfect the wiring is above it. The machine will just refuse to move." One of the senior engineers folded his arms. "And you know that because?" "Because I used to study this," Marin said simply, and left it there, focused instead on working the pin free with steady fingers before resetting the mechanical lever behind it. Less than a minute later, the control panel flickered green from top to bottom. Cooling fans spun to life, and the robotic arm completed its startup sequence exactly as it had in every successful test that year. The lab erupted. Engineers who had spent all morning silent now clapped and shouted over each other, and one of the maintenance logs was pulled up within minutes, confirming that a temporary technician had skipped the final release step during transport that same morning. The machine had never been broken at all. It had simply never been fully unlocked. Gareth walked over to Marin while the rest of the room celebrated around them. "Where does someone who cleans my laboratories learn to read a surgical robot better than my own head of engineering?" he asked, low enough that only she could hear. Marin told him the truth, plainly, without asking for anything in return, about the university she had left, the father she was still caring for, and the notebook she still carried home every night out of habit more than hope. "I didn't stop learning," she said. "I just stopped having anywhere to put it." He said nothing for a long moment, watching her the way he rarely watched anyone. "Would you consider joining the engineering team?" he finally asked. "Paid. Starting this week, if you want it." Marin's first instinct was disbelief. followed quickly by fear that this was a kindness that would evaporate once the excitement of the morning wore off, the way good intentions from powerful people so often did. "You don't even know if I can do the job," she said carefully. "You just did," Gareth answered. "In under a minute, in front of every expert I hired." She accepted anyway, because refusing a chance like that out of fear felt like its own kind of defeat, and because somewhere underneath the caution she still remembered what it felt like to want this badly. Her first morning on the engineering floor, most of the team welcomed her with polite, careful curiosity, the kind reserved for someone whose story had already traveled faster than she had. One senior engineer did not bother with polite. Callum Ferris had been with the company for 6 years, had a framed doctorate on his office wall, and made it clear within the first hour that he thought promoting a former cleaner over an open competitive hire was, in his words, a publicity stunt dressed up as meritocracy. "I'm not here to take anyone's job," Marin told him plainly, the first time he said it to her face instead of behind her back. "I'm here to do the one they gave me. If you've got a problem with my math, check it. Don't just have a problem with my uniform." Callum did check her math, more than once, hunting for the mistake that would prove his point. He never found one. By the third week, he had started leaving technical questions on her desk instead of arguments. And by the sixth week, he was the one defending her in meetings she wasn't even in the room for, telling colleagues that whatever she lacked in paperwork, she made up for twice over in instinct. Victor Lang clapped along with everyone else that morning, though his smile did not reach his eyes. He had been the one who approved the vendor contract for the transport locks 18 months earlier, discreetly routing the purchase through a shell company he controlled and pocketing the difference between the original supplier's price and the cheaper, poorly machined parts that replaced it. The pin that failed that morning was not a random mistake. It was exactly the kind of part he had been installing in dozens of systems for over a year. He had assumed, wrongly, that any failure traceable to that component would be buried under a mountain of more complicated electronic troubleshooting long before anyone thought to examine a $2 pin by hand. Marin's discovery had not just embarrassed his engineering team. It had left a maintenance log with his signature sitting one careless glance away from exposing him. What none of his colleagues knew was that the money had never gone toward anything as simple as greed. 2 years earlier, his sister's husband had lost his small hardware business in a bad property deal, and Victor had quietly been covering their mortgage ever since, telling himself each month that it was a loan he would eventually repay once the business recovered, never quite admitting that the business was never coming back, and neither was the money. That night, alone in his car in the parking garage, he called his brother-in-law and told him, flatly, that they had a problem, and that the woman who found it needed to stay far away from anything involving parts inventory. His brother-in-law, who ran the shell company on paper only, asked nervously whether they should simply stop the substitutions altogether. Victor told him no, that stopping now would look exactly like what it was, and that the safer move was to keep everything running smoothly until the contract renewal cycle gave them a clean, unremarkable way to phase the whole arrangement out. For the first weeks on the engineering team, Marin kept mostly to herself, arriving early enough to review manuals before anyone else showed up, and staying late enough that the security guard, a soft-spoken older woman named Beatrice Okafor, started leaving the hallway lights on later just for her. Beatrice had worked the night shift at Holloway Robotics for 11 years, ever since her husband passed, and she had watched enough people come and go through that lobby to recognize the ones who actually deserved to stay. "You eat dinner? Or just coffee again?" Beatrice asked one night, setting a foil-wrapped sandwich on the edge of Marin's desk without waiting for permission. "My daughter packs me extra. Somebody around here should eat something that isn't vending machine crackers." Marin laughed, surprised, and thanked her. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," Beatrice said, already walking away. "That's usually why it counts." Snow gathered outside the tall lab windows most evenings that month, and Marin found herself watching it the way she used to watch it from her father's kitchen window, half expecting the good fortune to melt away just as quietly as it had arrived. Gareth found reasons to walk past the engineering floor more often than his schedule strictly required. He told himself it was because he needed to monitor the surgical system's final testing phase before the delayed public launch, which was true, though it was not the whole truth. He liked the way Marin explained problems out loud to herself while she worked, the way she double-checked her own math instead of assuming she was right, a habit he had never seen in engineers twice her seniority. One evening in early December, Marin stayed past midnight running stress tests on a revised locking mechanism she had personally redesigned, one that could not be swapped for a cheaper part without the entire safety system flagging the change automatically. Gareth found her there, sleeves rolled up, hair falling loose from its clip, entirely unaware that anyone was watching her work. He set a coffee down beside her without a word and pulled up a chair. "You know, most people go home eventually," he said. "Most people didn't spend 3 years wondering if they'd ever get to do this again," Marin answered, not looking up from her notes. Gareth studied her for a moment. "Tell me about him." "Your father." Marin finally set down her pen. "He taught shop class for 30 years. Rebuilt half the lawnmowers in our neighborhood for free because he liked watching kids figure things out. Then his heart started failing 4 years ago, and figuring things out got a lot more expensive." She paused. "He still thinks I'm going to march in here one day and tell everyone what I used to be." "You did," Gareth said. "You just didn't need to march." She almost smiled at that. "What about you?" "Nobody builds something like this because they slept well as a kid." Gareth exhaled, leaning back. "My father ran this company before I did. Walked out when I was 19, took half the patents with him, told the board I wasn't ready and never would be. I built all of this partly to prove he was wrong, and partly because I still don't fully trust that I'm not wrong myself." He hadn't said that out loud to anyone in years, and it surprised him how easily it came out to her. Neither of them said anything else that night that could be mistaken for more than friendship. But something had shifted in the space between them, quiet and unhurried as the snow falling outside the window, the kind of change neither of them was in a hurry to name out loud. Victor noticed the late nights too. He noticed the coffee cups, the closed office door, the way Gareth had started routing certain safety decisions through Marin instead of through him. What worried Victor most was her redesigned locking mechanism, still weeks from formal review, sitting in a shared drive folder with an audit trail that would eventually connect every faulty part back to his old vendor contract, if anyone with authority ever went looking closely enough. He decided the safest move was to make sure nobody kept looking. 2 weeks before the public product launch, Victor filed a formal complaint against Marin with the board of directors, accusing her of unauthorized tampering with a regulated medical device, citing her redesign of the locking mechanism as a violation of company safety protocol that could jeopardize the device's federal approval. He timed it carefully, choosing a week when Gareth was traveling for investor meetings on the East Coast and unreachable for 2 full days. "She has no engineering license," Victor told the board, sliding a folder across the table. "No degree on file. A cleaner with 2 years of college coursework has been making unsupervised modifications to a device that could kill someone on an operating table if it fails again. I'm not trying to punish her. I'm trying to protect this company from a lawsuit we cannot survive." The board, cautious about anything that might delay federal clearance, voted to suspend Marin pending an internal review and escort her from the building that same afternoon. Beatrice watched from the security desk as 2 junior staff members walked Marin to the lobby doors, her badge deactivated before she had even reached the elevator, snow already collecting on the sidewalk outside, as if the whole city had decided to match her mood. "This isn't right," Beatrice said in a low voice to the staff member holding the clipboard, but the young man only shrugged and said it wasn't his call. Marin did not cry until she was 3 blocks away, standing at a bus stop with her coat pulled tight against a wind that cut straight through the wool, watching her own breath disappear into snow that had started falling harder now, thick white flakes catching in her eyelashes and blurring the streetlights into soft, useless halos. She thought of her father waiting for her at home, expecting to hear about another good day, and she did not know how she was going to explain that the second chance she had finally been given had been taken away in less time than it took to read a single email. When she finally told him that night, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from, he reached across and covered her hand with his. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. "I've watched you fix things your whole life, Marin. The only thing broken here is whoever decided you weren't worth trusting." For 2 days, Marin did not touch her old notebook at all. It sat on the kitchen table where she had left it, and every time she walked past it, she felt less like an engineer who had been suspended and more like a woman who had been foolish enough to believe a door could actually stay open. She told her father, in a flat, tired voice, that maybe it was better to find work somewhere that never asked her to hope for anything in the first place, somewhere small enough that losing it wouldn't hurt this much. Her father listened without interrupting, then set 2 mugs of coffee on the table and sat down across from her the way he used to when she brought home a broken carburetor as a teenager, convinced she'd ruined it beyond repair. "You didn't lose anything," he said. "They took something from you. That's different. One of those means you give up. The other means you get it back." Marin didn't answer, but she also didn't throw the notebook away. Callum showed up at her apartment on the second evening, uninvited, holding a folder of his own. He had pulled every test result Marin had logged on the new locking mechanism over the past month and cross-checked them against the federal safety standard himself, on his own time. "For what it's worth," he said, standing awkwardly in her doorway with snow still on his shoulders, "your design passes every benchmark Victor's complaint claims it violates. I don't know what he's actually afraid of, but it isn't bad engineering." When Gareth landed back in Denver 2 days later and heard what had happened, he went straight to Victor's office without stopping to remove his coat. "You suspended her while I was on a plane," Gareth said. "You didn't think that was worth a phone call?" Victor stayed calm, hands folded on his desk. "I followed protocol, Gareth. Unauthorized modifications to a federally regulated device are not a small thing. I did what any operations officer would do to protect this company. If you'd been reachable, I would have told you myself." Gareth wanted to believe it, because the alternative meant admitting that someone he had trusted for a decade might be lying to his face, and some part of him still flinched away from that kind of suspicion the way a burned hand flinches from a stove. "I'll review the file myself before making a final decision," he said, and left the office with a knot in his chest that would not loosen no matter how he tried to reason with it. He spent the entire next day chasing dead ends, pulling procurement records that had been filed correctly, invoices that matched their contracts on paper, nothing that gave him anything solid enough to act on. By evening, he had almost convinced himself Victor's explanation had been true after all, and that he was about to ruin a decade of loyalty over nothing more than a bad feeling. It was Callum who finally found the thread worth pulling, staying behind after his own shift to help without being asked, cross-referencing serial numbers on the transport locks against the manufacturer's public parts catalog. "These don't exist," Callum said, turning his laptop screen toward Gareth. "Not from this supplier. Whoever's fulfilling these orders isn't who the paperwork says they are." That night, Gareth pulled every version of the locking mechanism audit trail Marin had ever touched, cross-referencing timestamps against the original vendor contracts from 18 months earlier, the ones Victor had personally approved. What he found did not prove anything conclusively on its own, but it raised a question he could not put down. Every single faulty transport lock traced back to the same supplier, and that supplier's payments routed through an account that shared an address with Victor's brother-in-law. He drove to Marin's apartment that same night, through streets already blanketed white, snow still falling steadily under the orange glow of the street lamps, his headlights carving 2 narrow tunnels through the storm. He was not entirely sure what he planned to say when he got there, only that he could not let another night pass with her believing he had chosen not to look. Marin opened the door to find him standing on her doorstep with snow melting in his hair. "I should have trusted my own instincts about you from the first morning," he said before she could speak. "Instead, I let 10 years of habit talk me out of it for 2 whole days. I'm sorry." She let him in, more out of exhaustion than forgiveness, and listened as he laid out what he had found and what he still needed to prove before it would hold up to the board. "Even if you're right about Victor," she said, "it's still my name on that suspension letter, not his." "I know," Gareth said. "That's why I'm not leaving until we fix it properly, out in the open." For the first time that week, Marin allowed herself to hope again, carefully, the way you test ice before putting your full weight on it. The public product launch was rescheduled for the following week, timed deliberately to coincide with the board's quarterly review, and Gareth spent every hour leading up to it steadily building a case alongside 2 auditors he trusted completely, cross-checking invoices, comparing signatures, and matching component serial numbers against the shell company's shipping records. Beatrice turned out to be an unexpected piece of that case. She had kept a personal log of every after-hours visitor to the building for years, an old habit from her days working security at a hospital where such records had once saved a colleague's job. Her notes showed Victor entering the parts storage room alone on 11 separate nights over the past year, always after the loading dock cameras had already looped back to the start of their recording cycle, a blind spot only someone who had installed the camera system himself would know how to exploit. "I wasn't trying to catch anybody," Beatrice told Gareth when he asked to see the log. "I just like knowing who's in my building at 2 in the morning." Guess it finally came in handy. On the morning of the rescheduled launch, the same investors and regulators from the failed demonstration filled the auditorium again, though this time the snow outside had finally stopped, leaving the city bright and startlingly clear under a low winter sun. Victor stood near the front of the room in a new suit, confident that whatever suspicions Gareth harbored had not yet solidified into anything he could prove in public. Gareth opened the presentation as scheduled, walking the room through the surgical system's redesigned safety mechanisms, crediting the engineer who had identified the original failure by name for the first time in front of cameras, reporters, and every investor whose money the company needed. Marin stood at the side of the stage, badge reinstated that morning, watching a room full of strangers hear her name spoken with respect instead of laughter. Then Gareth changed course. "Before we continue," he said, "there's something the board and our investors deserve to know about why this system failed in the first place." He nodded to one of the auditors, who stepped forward with a folder of her own. The room went still in the particular way rooms go still when everyone senses a story turning into something else entirely. Victor stood quickly. "This is premature, Gareth. That audit isn't finalized." "It's finalized enough," Gareth said, and gestured for the projector to continue. The auditor pulled up the shipping manifest for the transport locks, the vendor address highlighted in red, matching a business registration filed publicly with the state 2 years earlier under Victor's brother-in-law's name. A murmur ran through the investors, sharp and immediate, the sound of confidence draining out of a room all at once. Priscilla Renner, who had sat through the failed demonstration weeks earlier with her arms folded and her patience visibly running out, now leaned forward in her seat with an entirely different expression, the look of someone who had just watched a company prove it was more trustworthy, not less. "That address means nothing," Victor said louder now. "Plenty of businesses share buildings. You're trying to ruin a decade of work over a coincidence." "It's not a coincidence when it happens 11 times," Gareth said, and nodded again. Beatrice's after-hours log appeared next on the screen, 11 dates lined up beside 11 loading dock deliveries that matched exactly, each one timed to the minute the camera system reset itself. Victor's face had gone pale. "You're taking the word of a night security guard and a cleaner over 10 years of loyalty," he said, and the word cleaner landed in the room like a slap, several investors visibly recoiling at the sound of it. "I'm taking the word of the evidence," Gareth said evenly. Both of them just happened to be paying closer attention than you expected anyone to. Security stepped forward at Gareth's signal, and Victor was escorted out through the same lobby doors Marin had been walked through 2 weeks earlier, past investors who would not meet his eyes, into a morning finally free of snow. Nobody in the room clapped this time. It was not that kind of moment. But nobody looked away either. A reporter near the back of the auditorium raised a hand before the room had even finished settling, asking Marin directly how it felt to go from being escorted out of the building to standing on its stage in the same month. Marin thought about brushing the question off the way she brushed off most attention, then decided, for the first time in her life, not to shrink from it. "It feels like the truth finally had time to catch up," she said. "It usually does, if you're patient enough to let it." The board voted unanimously by the end of that week to terminate Victor's contract and refer the matter to federal investigators, and the surgical system launched 3 weeks later than planned, but with every part on it verified twice over. Hospitals began ordering the device within a month, and by spring the first successful surgeries using it were saving patients whose conditions had been considered too fragile to operate on before. Priscilla Renner's fund led the next round of investment 2 months later, and when she signed the paperwork she asked, almost as an afterthought, that a clause be added requiring the company's safety review board to always include at least one engineer promoted from within its own ranks, not hired from outside it. Gareth agreed without hesitation, and told her privately that he intended to nominate Marin for that very seat before she had even finished asking. Marin was promoted to lead safety engineer that same spring, a title that came with her own office, her own team, and a signature that now carried real weight on every device the company shipped. Her father, healthier now that better insurance came with her new position, liked to tell anyone who visited that his daughter had once fixed a $50 million machine with a $2 part, and he never got tired of watching people's faces when they realized he was not exaggerating. Beatrice retired that June, and at her farewell gathering it was Marin who stood up first to speak. 11 dates in a notebook, she said, raising her glass toward the older woman. That's what protected this whole building, more than any camera system ever did. Some of the most important work anyone does here happens in rooms nobody thinks to thank. I got to keep my job because a woman at a security desk decided paying attention was worth doing even when nobody was watching her do it. Beatrice waved a hand, embarrassed, but she was smiling the whole ride home that night. Callum, standing near the back with a drink he'd barely touched, raised his glass toward Marin without a word, the closest thing to an apology he ever managed to give her, and the closest thing to one she ever needed. That same autumn, Marin spent a Saturday in her father's garage helping him rebuild an old snowblower engine for a neighbor, the way she used to before her hands belonged to laboratories instead of driveways. He handed her a wrench without being asked, the way he had 100 times when she was 12, and told her that watching her use a company's entire engineering budget didn't impress him half as much as watching her still remember how to do this with nothing but a socket set and cold fingers. She laughed, and for a moment neither of them mentioned the company at all, just the engine and the quiet, ordinary satisfaction of fixing something with your own hands. Gareth waited until the following winter to say anything about the way he felt, not out of hesitation exactly, but out of a careful, deliberate respect for the fact that she now worked 2 floors below his office, and he did not want either of them to wonder, years later, whether her success had ever been about anything other than her own extraordinary mind. He asked her to coffee the way he had brought her coffee that first late night, plainly, without ceremony. "I've been waiting a full year to ask you this properly," he admitted, turning his own cup slowly on the table between them. "I needed you to have your title, your team, your own name on the door first. I didn't want there to be any question about why I was asking." Marin hesitated before answering, turning her cup slowly in her hands, thinking of every reason a woman in her position might have to say no. The gossip, the power imbalance, the fear of becoming a story people whispered about in the break room instead of an engineer people respected. "And if I say yes," she said carefully, "does that become the story instead? The cleaner and the CEO?" "Only if you let it be," Gareth said. "I'd rather it just be us." She thought of her father's voice telling her that knowledge should never be wasted, and decided that neither should this. "Then yes," she said. She said it on an evening when the season's first real snow was just beginning to fall outside the window, soft and unhurried, settling over the city the way it had settled over her that terrible night she walked home from the bus stop believing her second chance had already ended. This time the snow felt different, less like something closing in and more like something quietly starting over. They were married 2 winters later in a small ceremony at her father's house, with Beatrice seated in the front row and a light snow falling just outside the windows the entire afternoon. Exactly the kind of quiet, unremarkable magic Marin had always found in the season, the kind that asks nothing of you and simply waits patiently for you to notice it was there all along. Her father walked her down the short hallway to the living room himself, steady on his feet in a way that still felt like a small miracle some mornings, and told her quietly, in a low, steady voice just before the music started, that her mother would have liked this man, and would have liked even more that Marin had never once stopped believing she deserved him. "Before this story comes to an end, we would love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated because of the job you had to take rather than the one you wanted? Please leave a comment below, because your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today." Years later, when new hires walked through the Holloway Robotics lobby for the first time, they would often notice a small brass plaque near the security desk dedicated to Beatrice Okafor, and beside it a framed photograph of a young woman in a cleaner's uniform kneeling beside an open control panel, captioned simply with the date of the morning everything changed. Gareth still told the story to every new engineering class personally, ending it the same way each time, by reminding them that the most important discovery his company ever made was not a machine at all, but the reminder that talent rarely announces itself, and the people willing to listen for it are the ones who end up changing everything. Callum eventually took over training the company's newest engineers himself and made a habit of walking each incoming class past that same photograph before their first shift, telling them, half joking and half not, that the smartest person in any given room at Holloway Robotics was rarely the one with the loudest title, and that they would do well to remember it before they assumed otherwise. On the shelf behind Marin's desk, beside her framed engineering license, sat the same worn notebook she had once carried home out of habit more than hope, its cover soft and cracked now from years of use. She never put it away. New engineers on her team would sometimes ask about it, and she always gave them the same answer, that it was proof knowledge was never wasted, only waiting for the right room to be spoken out loud in. Watching from her office window some winters later, she would still pause whenever the season's first snow began to fall, remembering a bus stop, a locked door, and a father who had never once doubted her. And she would think that some kinds of cold only exist to remind you how much warmth is still waiting on the other side of them. If this story warmed you tonight, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who could use a little hope today, and subscribe to Winter Veil so you never miss the next story. Thank you for staying until the very end, and I will see you in the next one.